outnumbered every day. That was the reality George Beurling faced in the summer of 1942 over the besieged island of Malta. The Axis forces were launching hundreds of bombers and fighters every day. The sky was black with enemy aircraft. The island had maybe a dozen serviceable Spitfires on any given morning, sometimes only 2 or 3. Every pilot knew the odds. Every scramble meant flying against 50 or 60 enemy aircraft. Most pilots counted themselves lucky to survive a few weeks in Malta's murderous sky. But George Beurling did not just survive. He became the deadliest Allied fighter pilot of the Malta campaign, shooting down 27 Axis aircraft in just 14 flying days. This is the story of relentless, brutal aerial combat over the most bombed place on Earth. The story of a pilot who mastered deflection shooting when others barely understood it. The story of a young man who turned aerial combat into a mathematical science. And the story of why George Frederick Beurling became known as the Falcon of Malta. June 9, 1942, early afternoon, Takali Airfield, Malta. Sergeant Pilot George Beurling climbed out of his Spitfire after the long flight from HMS Eagle. The Mediterranean crossing had been harrowing, flying for hours with a belly tank over enemy waters. But Beurling had made it. He was finally on Malta with No. 249 Squadron. This was what he had volunteered for. This was the combat he had been seeking. Malta in June 1942 was experiencing the worst aerial siege in history. German and Italian air forces were bombing the tiny island day and night, trying to starve it into submission. Between March and April, the Axis had dropped over 6,700 tons of bombs on Malta. That was more tonnage than fell on London during the entire Blitz. The people of Malta were living in caves and shelters, emerging only when the raids stopped. Food was rationed to starvation levels. The island was running out of ammunition, fuel, and medicine. King George VI had awarded the entire island the George Cross in April to honor their courage. But medals could not stop bombs, and Malta was slowly being destroyed. The RAF fighter pilots defending Malta faced impossible odds every single day. A typical raid consisted of 60 to 80 bombers escorted by 30 to 60 fighters. Malta might scramble 6 Spitfires to intercept, sometimes only 3. The fighters would climb to altitude, look up, and see the sky filled with enemy aircraft. Then they would dive into that swarm and try to break up the formation before the bombs fell. Pilots were outnumbered 10 to 1, 15 to 1, sometimes 20 to 1. Most were shot down or killed within their first few weeks. George Beurling looked at those odds and saw opportunity. George Frederick Beurling had been born in Verdun, Quebec, Canada, on December 6, 1921. His father was Frederick Gustav Beurling, a Swedish immigrant who worked as a commercial artist for Claude Neon Company. His mother was Hetty Florence Gibbs, of English descent, born in the Montreal suburb of Pointe-Saint-Charles. George was the third of 5 children in a deeply religious family. The Beurlings were devout Christians who did not drink, smoke, or swear. They attended church regularly and raised their children with strict moral principles. George would carry a Bible with him throughout his military service and never flew without it. When George was 6 years old, his father built him a wooden model airplane. That simple gift ignited an obsession that would define George's entire life. He became fascinated with aircraft, spending hours watching planes at the local airfield. Young George would skip school to hang around the LaSalle Road Airport in Montreal. He would do odd jobs for the pilots, washing planes and sweeping hangars in exchange for rides. His parents and teachers punished him repeatedly for truancy, but George did not care. All he wanted was to fly. George's parents wanted him to study at McGill University and become a commercial artist like his father. But at age 15, George quit school to work and save money for flying lessons. He built and sold model airplanes to earn extra income. He also went hunting for game birds to improve his marksmanship and learn about leading moving targets. By age 16, George had logged 150 flying hours. He passed all examinations for a commercial pilot license while most teenagers were still in high school. In 1933, when George was just 12 years old, he first took the controls of an aircraft. By 1938, at age 17, he was flying solo. George left home to work for an air freight company in Gravenhurst, Ontario. He became a bush pilot, flying cargo and supplies to remote northern communities. The work was dangerous, but George loved every minute of it. In 1939, George won an aerobatics contest in Edmonton, Alberta. He competed against both civilian and military pilots and defeated them all. George's natural flying ability was becoming apparent to everyone who watched him. When World War II broke out in September 1939, George immediately tried to enlist. He went to the Royal Canadian Air Force recruiting office and offered his services as a pilot, but the RCAF rejected him because he lacked a high school diploma. George had over 150 hours of flying experience, a commercial license, and competition victories. None of that mattered because he had quit school at 15. Frustrated but undeterred, George tried to join the Chinese Nationalist Air Force. He attempted to cross into the United States and make his way to China, but he was arrested at the border as an illegal immigrant and sent back to Canada. George then tried to join the Finnish Air Force during the Winter War against the Soviet Union, but he could not get his parents' permission, and that plan fell through as well. George tried again to join the RCAF and was rejected again. The frustration must have been maddening. George was a licensed pilot being turned away during wartime. Finally, George decided to cross the Atlantic and try his luck with the Royal Air Force. In May 1940, George signed on as a deckhand aboard a merchant ship bound for Scotland. The Atlantic crossing was terrifying. German submarines were sinking Allied ships daily, but George's ship made it safely to Glasgow in June 1940. George immediately went to the RAF recruiting office to enlist, but the RAF refused to accept him because he had no documents proving his identity. George had forgotten to bring his birth certificate from Canada. So George worked his way back across the submarine-infested Atlantic to get his birth certificate. Then he crossed the Atlantic again in September 1940, this time with proper documentation. The RAF finally accepted George Beurling as a trainee pilot. George entered RAF flight training and immediately impressed his instructors. He already had extensive flying experience from his bush pilot days. But George declined officer training, preferring to remain an enlisted sergeant pilot. He completed advanced training and graduated with his wings in September 1941. George was posted to No. 7 Operational Training Unit at RAF Hawarden. At Hawarden, George came under the influence of squadron leader James Lacey, known as Ginger Lacey. Lacey was already a Battle of Britain ace with 27 confirmed victories. Lacey later commented about George, "There are not two ways about it. He was a wonderful pilot and an even better shot." At Hawarden, George immersed himself completely in the science of aerial gunnery. He studied deflection shooting, which is the art of aiming ahead of a moving target. George learned to calculate range, bullet drop, and the enemy aircraft's speed and trajectory. He practiced until these calculations became automatic, until flying and shooting became one single action. George had exceptional eyesight that allowed him to spot enemy aircraft before anyone else. Combined with his mathematical understanding of deflection, George was becoming a deadly marksman in the air. In December 1941, George was posted to No. 403 Squadron RCF. The squadron had just moved to North Weald, Essex, and was flying Hawker Hurricanes. George flew his first combat mission on Christmas Day, 1941. The mission was uneventful, but George was finally flying combat operations. For the next 4 months, George flew bomber escort missions and fighter sweeps across the English Channel. But in early 1942, RCF policy changed. Canadian squadrons were now required to be staffed entirely by RCAF personnel. George was technically RAF, not RCAF, so he was transferred to No. 41 Squadron RAF in Sussex. On May 1, 1942, George flew his third mission with 41 Squadron. The squadron was on a sweep over Calais when 5 Focke-Wulf FW-190s attacked. George was flying tail-end Charlie, the last position in the formation and the most dangerous. German pilots always attacked from behind, targeting tail-end Charlie first. George's Spitfire was hit multiple times. Half his guns were knocked out. But George was the first pilot to spot the attacking Germans diving out of the sun. His exceptional eyesight and situational awareness had saved him. George managed to evade the German fighters and bring his damaged Spitfire home. But his squadron commander was unimpressed with George's flying. George had a habit of breaking formation to pursue targets without permission. He was brilliant in the air but terrible at following orders. George was reprimanded multiple times for attacking enemy aircraft without authorization. He was a loner who disdained teamwork and ignored his commanders. George's superiors considered him unpredictable and difficult, but George did not care about their opinions. He volunteered for a posting to Malta, the most dangerous assignment in the RAF. Most pilots dreaded being sent to Malta because survival rates were so low. But George saw Malta as the ultimate test of his skills. On June 7, 1942, George boarded HMS Eagle at Gibraltar. The carrier was transporting 32 new Spitfires to Malta as part of Operation Salient. 2 days later, on June 9th, George took off from Eagle's flight deck. The flight to Malta was over 400 miles, requiring extra fuel tanks and perfect navigation. George flew for hours over open water with enemy territory on all sides. Finally, he spotted Malta and landed safely at Takali Airfield. George was assigned to No. 249 Squadron, one of Malta's most experienced units. His nickname on Malta quickly became Screwball, an expletive he used constantly. June 12, 1942, mid-morning, the scramble alarm sounded at Takali. George and 3 other pilots from 249 Squadron ran to their Spitfires. 8 Messerschmitt Bf-109s were inbound, a typical Malta raid. The 4 Spitfires climbed to intercept, outnumbered 2-1. This was George's baptism of fire over Malta. George dove into the formation of German fighters and opened fire on a Bf-109. He claimed to have blown the tail off the Messerschmitt, but nobody saw it hit the ground. George was credited with 1 enemy aircraft damaged, not destroyed. It was a frustrating start, but George would soon prove his deadly accuracy. July 6, 1942, George and other pilots from 249 Squadron intercepted a massive raid. 3 Kant Z-1007 BIS bombers were escorted by 14 Reggiane Re 2001s and over 24 Machi C-202s. The Spitfires were outnumbered more than 10-1. George attacked the formation and shot down an Italian fighter flown by Sergente Francesco Pecchiari. Then he claimed another Machi that crashed near Zeytun, likely the Reggiane of Sottotenente Romano Pagliani. 2 confirmed kills in 1 mission. George was finding his rhythm. The Italians claimed 2 Spitfires shot down during that fight. One of the Italian pilots was Furio Nicolò Doglio, who would become George's most famous victim. On July 24th, George was awarded the Distinguished Flying Medal. By mid-July, George had destroyed 8 enemy aircraft and was becoming a recognized ace. But his biggest day was yet to come. July 27th, 1942, became known as George Beurling's biggest day over Malta. That morning, George intercepted a formation of Italian fighters over Gozo, Malta's sister island. He shot down Sergente Faliero Gelli flying a Machi MC-202. Immediately after, George attacked the formation leader, Captain Furio Nicolò Doglio. Doglio was an experienced Italian ace with multiple victories. George got on Doglio's tail and fired a precise burst, his deflection calculations perfect. Doglio's Machi MC-202 went down. The Italian captain was killed. Then George claimed 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters. One of those German fighters was flown by Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Preu of Jagdgeschwader 53. Preu was a 5-kill ace, an experienced fighter pilot. George shot him down in flames, though some sources attribute the kill to anti-aircraft fire. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed in 1 day. George's total now stood at 14 confirmed kills. He had been on Malta for less than 2 months and was already the island's top ace. George's method was simple but devastatingly effective. He would only engage enemy aircraft at 250 yards or less point-blank range. Most pilots would break away at that distance, fearing collision or return fire. But George would close to within feet of his target before firing. His deflection shooting was so precise that he rarely needed more than a short burst. George would fire, see strikes on the enemy aircraft, then immediately break away. He never wasted ammunition, never stayed in position longer than necessary. Fellow pilots watched in amazement as George turned aerial combat into a cold science. In late July, George received a bar to his Distinguished Flying Medal. His total of confirmed victories was now 17 destroyed. George was promoted to pilot officer and awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. But the constant combat was taking a terrible toll. Malta's pilots were flying multiple sorties every day, sometimes 5 or 6 scrambles. The airfields were bombed constantly. Aircraft were destroyed on the ground before they could take off. Pilots would land to refuel and rearm, and German bombers would attack while they were on the ground. In April 1942, Malta had lost 80 Spitfires and Hurricanes. Most were destroyed on the ground or shot down trying to land. The island was under siege, food was scarce, and everyone was slowly starving. George lost 50 pounds during his time on Malta. He contracted dysentery from the poor food and contaminated water. He was hospitalized multiple times during August and September, too sick to fly. But as soon as George could stand, he would return to the flight line. On September 25th, George had another successful day. He shot down 3 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, 2 destroyed and 1 damaged. His total was now climbing past 20 confirmed victories. George had also been shot down himself once, ditching in a field after his aircraft was damaged. He walked away unhurt, climbed into another Spitfire, and flew again the same day. October 10th, 1942, George was testing his newly serviced Spitfire. He was vectored to intercept 2 Bf-109s flying low over the water near Filfla Island. George attacked and reported hitting the starboard aircraft in the engine. The Messerschmitt pancaked belly down on the water and flipped onto its back. George then hit the second Bf-109's fuel tank, and the aircraft exploded. 2 more victories brought George's Malta total to 21 confirmed. However, no record exists of Messerschmitts crashing on Malta on October 10th. German records show no losses that day, raising questions about some of George's claims. But there was no question about what happened on October 13th and 14th. October 13th, 1942. Morning, 3 miles north of St. Paul's Bay. George attacked a formation of Junkers Ju-88 bombers, escorted by 30 Bf-109 fighters. He claimed to have hit a bomber first, then attacked an oncoming Bf-109 that burst into flames. Seconds later, George fired at a second Bf-109 without seeing strikes. But the German pilot bailed out, giving George credit for the kill. 3 enemy aircraft destroyed in one mission. October 14th, 1942, would be George's last flight over Malta. That morning, George scrambled with 6 other pilots to intercept a massive raid. Junkers Ju-88 bombers were escorted by 60 Bf-109s, Machi 202s, and Reggiane 2001s. The 7 Spitfires climbed to meet over 60 enemy aircraft. George dove on the bomber formation and strafed a Ju-88. He claimed the bomber shot down, but return fire from the Ju-88's gunner raked his Spitfire. George picked up about 30 bullet holes in his aircraft. But George did not break off the attack. He climbed back into the fight and attacked a Messerschmitt Bf-109. George claimed to have damaged the fighter, then attacked another Bf-109. He reported blowing the left wing off at the root, the Messerschmitt tumbling from the sky. Then another German fighter hit George from below. Cannon shells tore through George's Spitfire, the cockpit filled with smoke and flames. George was wounded in the heel, elbow, and ribs. His Spitfire was on fire and going down. George struggled with the canopy, finally managed to open it. He unbuckled his harness and bailed out as the Spitfire fell away beneath him. George's parachute opened, and he descended toward the Mediterranean. He hit the water and inflated his life jacket, bleeding from multiple wounds. A rescue launch spotted George and pulled him from the sea. He was rushed to hospital with shrapnel wounds and burns. George Beurling's war over Malta was finished. In 4 months on Malta, George had claimed over 27 enemy aircraft destroyed. He was the highest-scoring Allied pilot of the entire Malta campaign. No other RAF pilot came close to George's total. On October 13, 1942, the London Gazette published George's Distinguished Service Order citation. The citation read, "Since being awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, Pilot Officer Beurling has destroyed a further 6 enemy aircraft, bringing his total victories to 28. During one sortie on October 13th, he shot down a Junkers 88 and 2 Messerschmitt 109s. The following day, in a head-on attack on enemy bombers, he destroyed one of them, before he observed his leader being attacked by an enemy fighter. Although wounded, Pilot Officer Beurling destroyed the fighter. Then climbing again, although his aircraft was hit by enemy fire, he shot down another fighter, before his own aircraft was so damaged that he was forced to abandon it. He descended safely onto the sea and was rescued. This officer's skill and daring are unexcelled. George was evacuated from Malta on October 31st, 1942. He was flown to Gibraltar aboard a consolidated B-24 Liberator transport. But the Liberator crashed into the sea shortly after takeoff from Gibraltar. 15 people aboard were killed in the crash. George Beurling was one of only 3 survivors. George was encumbered by a heavy cast on his wounded foot. He struggled in the water but managed to swim to shore. George had survived Malta, survived being shot down, and now survived a transport crash. After recovering in England, George was sent back to Canada. Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King had personally ordered George home. Canada's greatest fighter ace was needed for the 3rd Victory Loan fundraising drive. The irony was not lost on George. The RCAF had rejected him twice before the war. Now they were parading him across Canada as a national hero. George hated every minute of the war bond tour. He was still in pain from his wounds. His leg injury had not fully healed. George was exhausted and suffering from dysentery and malnutrition from his Malta service. But he was forced to give speeches at rallies and parades across Canada. George was a terrible public speaker and he knew it. He would often start his speeches by saying, "I'm no good at this." Worse, George said things that embarrassed the RCAF. When asked about combat, George admitted that he enjoyed killing the enemy. The RCAF public relations officers were horrified by George's brutal honesty. George was supposed to be selling war bonds, not talking about the pleasure of killing. During the tour, George met Diana Whittle, a Vancouver debutante. They married in Vancouver in 1943, but the marriage was doomed from the start. George showed interest in other women, even during their honeymoon. The marriage would end in separation in March 1945. In mid-1943, George completed his war bond tour. He was posted back to England and assigned as a gunnery instructor to No. 61 Operational Training Unit. But George lacked the patience to teach others. He yearned to get back into combat, back into the sky where he belonged. On September 1st, 1943, George transferred from the RAF to the RCF. He was promoted to flight lieutenant and posted to No. 403 Squadron at Kenley. The squadron was flying the new Spitfire Mark IX and preparing for operations over Europe. Wing Commander Johnny Johnson commanded the wing and reluctantly accepted George. Johnson knew George's reputation as a lone wolf who disdained teamwork. But Johnson decided to give Canada's greatest ace a chance. George was appointed gunnery officer, a position that seemed to suit him. In September 1943, George shot down one enemy aircraft over France. But George was unhappy flying sweeps in large formations. He wanted to hunt in pairs like he had over Malta, not fly in rigid formations. George requested command of a flight of Mustangs to carry out deep penetration raids. His request was denied. George's behavior became increasingly erratic. He buzzed the squadron headquarters repeatedly despite direct orders to stop. On November 1st, 1943, George saw his wing commander flying overhead in a Tiger Moth. George grabbed a shotgun and blasted the aircraft, putting small holes in the wing. The wing commander never knew what happened, but George's ground crew kept the secret. George was liked by his ground crew, even though he antagonized officers. In November 1943, George was transferred to Wing Commander Buck McNair's unit. But George's insubordination continued. He refused a direct order to stop buzzing headquarters. When his commanding officer confronted him, George snapped, "You can't tell me what to do." Then George immediately went up and buzzed the headquarters again. Any other pilot would have been court-martialed immediately. But George was Canada's top ace, a national hero with a DSO, DFC, and DFM with bar. The RCAF could not risk the public relations disaster of court-martialing their greatest pilot. In May 1944, George was quietly sent home to Canada. On October 16, 1944, George was given an honorable discharge from the RCAF. At age 22, George Beurling's war was over. George tried to join the United States Army Air Forces but was rejected. The Americans had heard about George's discipline problems and wanted no part of him. George was suddenly rudderless, unable to adjust to civilian life. All he knew was flying and combat, and now both were denied to him. His marriage to Diana Whittle ended in separation in March 1945. George drifted for 3 years, unable to find purpose. In 1948, George saw an opportunity. The new state of Israel was fighting for survival against Arab armies. The Israeli Air Force was recruiting experienced fighter pilots from around the world. George volunteered to fly P-51 Mustangs for Israel. He met another Malta veteran, Leonard Cohen, who was also going to Israel. Together they would smuggle a Nordeuin Norseman cargo plane to Israel as part of their duties. On May 20th, 1948, George and Cohen prepared to take off from Rome. The Norseman was fully fueled and ready for the long flight. George was in the cockpit as the engines started. The Norseman began its takeoff roll from Aeroporto dell'Urbe. Then the engines inexplicably failed just after the aircraft left the ground. George tried to make it back to the runway, but the Norseman was too low and too slow. The aircraft crashed short of the runway and exploded into a fireball. George Beurling and Leonard Cohen were killed instantly. George was 26 years old. Suspicion immediately centered on sabotage. Many believed British intelligence had sabotaged the aircraft to prevent pilots from reaching Israel. The British government was not pro-Israeli in 1948, but the cause of the crash was never proven. George's body was burned beyond recognition in the crash. Small brass plate on the coffin read Colonel George Beurling. His widow Diana and his family did not attend the funeral in Rome. George's coffin was kept for 3 months in a warehouse at Verano Cemetery. Nobody claimed the body of Canada's greatest fighter ace. Finally, Diana arranged for George to be buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. He was laid to rest near the graves of poets Percy Shelley and John Keats. In November 1950, 2.5 years after his death, George's casket was moved. Israeli authorities had George's remains transferred to Israel. He was reburied at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Haifa as a hero of Israel. George Beurling is honored across Canada. A street in Verdun, Quebec bears his name. Beurling Academy, a high school in Verdun, is named after him. The Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum displays a Spitfire painted in George's Malta markings. A statue of George stands at the museum, honoring his achievements. So what can we learn from George Beurling's story? What does his life tell us about skill, courage, and the cost of war? First, George's story demonstrates the power of obsessive dedication. George quit school at 15 to pursue flying. He crossed the Atlantic twice on merchant ships to join the RAF. He studied deflection shooting until the calculations became automatic. George transformed himself into a deadly aerial marksman through relentless practice and study. Second, George's story shows the difference between natural talent and developed skill. George had exceptional eyesight and natural flying ability. But what made him deadly was his mastery of deflection shooting. George turned aerial gunnery into a science, calculating lead and range with mathematical precision. He practiced until he could hit enemy aircraft from 250 yards with a short burst. That skill came from thousands of hours of study and practice, not just natural talent. Third, George's story illustrates the burden of being outnumbered. Malta's pilots faced impossible odds every single day. 3 or 4 Spitfires would scramble to intercept 60 enemy aircraft. The psychological pressure of those odds broke many pilots, but George thrived under that pressure. He saw the overwhelming numbers as opportunity, more targets to engage. Fourth, George's story reveals the dark side of heroism. George was Canada's greatest fighter ace with over 30 victories. He received the DSO, DFC, and DFM with bar for his courage. But George was also a difficult, insubordinate pilot who could not work in teams. He antagonized his officers and disobeyed direct orders. The RCF eventually discharged him because he was unmanageable. George's brilliance in combat could not overcome his inability to function within military discipline. Finally, George's story shows the tragedy of warriors unable to adapt to peace. George survived Malta, survived being shot down, survived a transport crash. But he could not survive peacetime. After the war, George drifted aimlessly, unable to find purpose. His marriage failed. His attempts to rejoin military service were rejected. George died at 26 in a mysterious crash while trying to reach another war. That summer over Malta in 1942, George Beurling faced impossible odds. The Axis forces were bombing the island with hundreds of aircraft every day. Malta had maybe a dozen Spitfires to defend against those massive raids. Every scramble meant flying against 50 or 60 enemy aircraft, outnumbered every day. But George did not flinch from those odds. He dove into formations of German and Italian fighters with mathematical precision. He closed to point-blank range and fired short, deadly bursts. He shot down 27 enemy aircraft in just 14 flying days. He became the highest-scoring Allied pilot of the entire Malta campaign. George Frederick Beurling, DSO, DFC, DFM, and BAR, was 26 years old when he died. He was a working-class kid from Verdun who quit school to chase his dream of flying. He was a pilot who crossed the Atlantic twice on merchant ships to join the war. He was a warrior who mastered deflection shooting and turned aerial combat into a science. And he was the Falcon of Malta who never backed down from impossible odds. In Verdun, Quebec, a street still bears his name. A high school honors his memory and teaches students about his achievements. In Haifa, Israel, George rests in Mount Carmel Cemetery as a hero. And in museums across Canada, his story is still told. They remember the boy who skipped school to watch airplanes. They remember the pilot who volunteered for Malta when others dreaded the assignment. They remember the ace who shot down enemy aircraft with mathematical precision. They remember skill under constant pressure, outnumbered every day. Those three words capture everything about George Beurling's war. Not that he succeeded against the odds, though he did. Not that he displayed extraordinary courage, though he did. But that every single day he flew into skies filled with enemy aircraft and refused to be intimidated. Because the mission mattered. Because Malta mattered. Because fighting mattered more than the odds. That is the legacy of George Frederick Beurling, DSO, DFC, DFM, and BAR.